Ask a Sopranos fan to name the saddest moment in the show, and you'll get a death almost every time. Adriana in the woods might come in your mind, or Bobby dying in the train store, or Eugene tragically taking his own life. Fair enough, but I don't think the deaths are actually where the sadness lives. By the time most of these people die, they've already lost the thing that mattered. A person, a future, or the version of themselves that could have had another life. The death is just where the story finally stops pretending otherwise. I'm going through all 26 of them, one at a time, counting down, and saving the one this whole family actually orbits for last. I'm going to start with someone that makes it very hard for us to feel bad or have any empathy towards. But still, there is something there even for her. Number 26, Livia. She suffers for real, and it never once makes her kind. Livia proves that suffering doesn't automatically make a person kind. She grows up poor and unhappy, marries a violent, unfaithful man who gives her almost no control over her own life, and by every measure she has a real claim to sympathy. She uses none of it to become gentler with anyone. Johnny is frightening and treats her terribly. He goes so far to firing a gun through her hair during an argument. When she nearly loses a pregnancy, he can't be bothered to show her the tenderness the moment calls for. None of that ever gets him held responsible for what she becomes. Imagine going through that every day. It does something to a person, no matter how strong the mentality. However, real pain doesn't excuse what she does with it. She turns care into guilt and every act of help into evidence that she's being disrespected. And by the time she dies, the room at her funeral can't even manage a kind word for her. Carmela says out loud that she made the people around her miserable. The saddest thing about her is that even with all the abuse she survived, surviving it taught her nothing except how to pass it along. Number 25, Jackie Jr. Jackie Jr. is the only major character in this show who dies still believing the exact story everyone else eventually stops believing. He never lives long enough to find out that the life isn't what the old war stories make it sound like. He inherits that belief instead of a father. His own father died before Jackie was old enough to ask him what any of it actually cost, so all Jackie has left is the legend, and the men who could correct it have every reason not to. Tony wants him out of the life and never once shows him a version of it that would convince him to leave. Ralph hands him the exact story that built Tony's own reputation, the old card game robbery, and tells it like a bedtime story instead of a warning, because admitting it was a warning would mean admitting what he actually is. Jackie does exactly what the story tells him a young man is supposed to do, and it kills him not long after. The same people who let him believe the myth are the ones who decide what happens to him once he acts on it. Every other death in this show comes with disillusionment already attached, a slow realization that the life cost more than it ever gave back. Jackie never gets that far. He's killed at the one moment his faith in all of it is still completely intact, which is its own kind of mercy, and also the saddest part of his story. Number 24, Eugene. He finally gets the money to leave and discovers that leaving was never his choice. Eugene finds out that money was never the thing standing between him and a different life. He inherits $2 million, more than enough to move his family to Florida and get his son away from heroin, and it changes nothing about the actual decision, because that decision was never his to make. He asks Tony for permission to retire. Tony refuses, because the oath Eugene took is treated as permanent no matter what's in his bank account. At the same time, the FBI, which he's secretly informing for, won't let him leave either. Two institutions that would otherwise agree on nothing agree completely that Eugene doesn't get to walk away. The saddest part isn't that he didn't have enough. It's that having enough was never going to be enough, and it takes him hanging himself in his own basement to prove it. Number 23, Meadow. Meadow's tragedy is that she gets smart enough to see through her family and then uses that intelligence to defend it instead. She spends her childhood being the one soprano who won't accept the evasions, who knows what her father does before anyone will say it out loud. Jackie Jr.'s murder should be the moment that confirms everything she already suspects. Instead, something shifts in how she processes it. She starts describing scrutiny of her family in the language of prejudice and government overreach, which happens to be exactly the vocabulary that lets her keep loving people she once challenged directly. By the finale, she's headed to law school, engaged to a mob associate's son, successful by every visible measure, and closer to the world she grew up in than the girl who used to mock her parents' excuses ever seemed likely to become. The kid who used to catch her parents in their lies grows up to be the lawyer who will help the family tell better ones. Number 22, Richie. He comes home from prison to a world that has already replaced him. Richie's problem is that he went to prison expecting the world to stay exactly as he left it, and 10 years is long enough for an entire hierarchy to rebuild itself around someone else. He comes home and treats Tony like the kid who used to answer to him, without noticing that those same 10 years are what let Tony stop being that kid. Even his own son has become a stranger in the time Richie's been gone, and Richie responds the only way he knows how, with the same rigid ideas about masculinity that fail him everywhere else. Janice looks briefly like a way back into relevance. It ends with her shooting him during an argument, and the family disposes of his body so completely that his own absence gets explained with a lie nobody's allowed to question. What makes it sadder is that 10 years away should have taught him this, and it teaches him nothing at all. Number 21. Ralph. He discovers helpless love only after showing so little mercy to other people. Ralph proves that cruelty was always a choice for him, not a limitation. He spends most of his time turning other people's suffering into entertainment, and then his own son gets hit by an arrow, and suddenly he's capable of grief so total it embarrasses the men around him. The same man who beat Tracy to death and immediately started managing the story afterward, it turns out he can feel everything, completely, the moment the suffering belongs to someone he loves. He was never incapable of empathy, he was just never willing to spend it on anyone who wasn't his. Paulie dies in a fire not long after, and Tony kills him for that, and the show never confirms whether he actually did it. That ambiguity is almost a mercy because a clean answer would let the audience feel finished with him, and Ralph earns the opposite. He dies having proven, once, that he knew all along what he'd been refusing everyone else. Number 20. Phil. His brother Billy dies protecting their side of a war that was never really about either of them, and for once Phil's rage has an origin any person would recognize as real. He never lets it stay simple. Tony kills Tony B himself specifically to deny Phil the revenge he wants, which turns real grief into a second theft, and Phil spends the rest of his life feeding both griefs into disputes that have nothing to do with Billy anymore. By the end, the brother he claims to be honoring is just the excuse for a war that gets Phil killed at a gas station in front of his own grandchildren, the family SUV rolling over the body of a man whose one genuine feeling turned into the reason his family has to watch him die. Number 19. Silvio. He gives everything to the role and ends with no voice at all. Silvio spends his whole life being the one man in the crew who never seems to need saving, and the show ends by taking away the only thing that ever made that true, his voice. He's Tony's number 2, the one who can stay calm when everyone else can't, and he uses that calm to do some of the ugliest work in the entire series. He helps kill Pussy. He drives Adriana to the woods himself. He strangles Bert with his own hands. None of that competence saves him. He's shot outside the Bing during the war with New York and ends up in a coma the doctors don't expect him to wake up from. The man whose entire value was knowing exactly what to say and do in any situation ends the show unable to say or do anything at all. Number 18. Janice. Janice is one of the rare people in this family who actually starts to change, and Tony can't stand it. She spends years reinventing herself, leaving for California, coming back, chasing Richie, and then Ralph, always talking, like the next version of her will finally be the one that sticks. With Bobby, something real finally does. She starts anger management. She stops exploding the way she used to. Tony notices, and instead of being glad for her, he goes looking for the one subject guaranteed to break her composure, her estranged son Harpo, and presses until she snaps in front of everyone. Her own growth is what he can't tolerate, because it makes his refusal to grow and all that much harder to ignore. Then Bobby is murdered, and the one stable thing Janice ever built for herself is gone too, leaving her a widow still carrying the same family habits she spent years trying to outrun. Number 17. Furio. The one relationship he wants requires him to betray everything around it. Furio gets the exit most people in this show only imagine, and the price is giving up the one thing he wants most. He falls for Carmela without ever touching her, and his uncle in Italy tells him plainly that the only way to have her is to kill his boss. He gets close. At a party, drunk and reckless, Tony ends up near a spinning helicopter blade, and for a second, Furio has every excuse in the world to let it happen. He doesn't. Staying keeps that same impossible choice alive every single day, so instead he disappears back to Italy, choosing to lose everything he built in America over becoming a man who'd kill for a woman he's never even kissed. Carmela never gets an explanation. Furio never gets her. The version of the story where he stays and does nothing wrong doesn't exist, so he removes himself from the story completely instead. Number 16. Big Pussy. Pussy's betrayal is sadder than simple greed because none of the love was fake, not his for them and not theirs for him. He starts informing because the money from an ordinary mob soldier's life isn't enough to give his kids the future he wants, and the FBI turns that into leverage he can't refuse. For over a year, he performs friendship with Tony, Silvio, and Paulie while carrying a wire, and the performance never fully separates from the real thing because he actually loves these men. That's what makes the boat scene so hard to watch. It's 3 friends killing someone they've eaten with and laughed with for decades, and meaning every bit of the grief that comes with it. He's weighted and dropped in the ocean, and the friendship doesn't go down with him. Tony keeps seeing him for years. Pussy tried to buy his children one future and ended up building the exact trap that took away his own. Number 15, Artie. He envies Tony while Tony's world keeps damaging his life. Artie spends the whole series wanting to be something that's already been the main source of damage in his own life, and he never quite connects the two. He watches Tony's money, women, and status and wants pieces of it while staying a civilian, without noticing that every time Tony's world touches his own, it costs him something. Tony burns down his first restaurant to protect him from a murder that never even happens there, and Artie loses his livelihood to a fire his best friend set on his behalf. He gets conned into a drug investment because he wants, for once, to operate like the men he admires, and gets beaten trying to collect his own money himself, since nobody ever explained that real wise guys don't do their own collecting. The shame gets bad enough that he swallows pills with alcohol and calls Tony to apologize while he's fading. It takes him most of the series to figure out that the life he envies has been one of the main things making his own life worse, and that recovering means giving up on ever borrowing it. Number 14, Melfi. Her strongest moral choice gives her no justice. Melfi does the one genuinely good thing almost nobody else in this show gets the chance to do, and the show refuses to reward her for it. After she's sexually abused and the case falls apart on a technicality, she has a direct line to the one man capable of getting her real, immediate justice, and she knows exactly what he'd do if she asked. She never asks. That refusal cost her the only version of revenge that would have felt like something, and the legal system gives her nothing to replace it with. Years later, she starts doubting whether treating Tony was worth it at all, whether therapy just gave a violent man better language to describe the same behavior, and she ends the relationship without ever getting a clear answer. She has more access to power than almost anyone in the series and uses none of it, and it's genuinely unclear whether the world is better for that restraint, or whether it just cost her something for nothing. Melfi went through a horrific experience believing that the justice she had always put her faith in would be there for her, only for that same system to let her attacker walk free because of a ridiculous technicality. Number 13, Patsy. Patsy's survival requires him to treat his own brother's murder as something ordinary, which might be a harder thing to do than grieving it honestly ever would have been. Tony orders the hit on Philly, and Patsy knows exactly where the decision came from, and he keeps working for the man who made it anyway. On the birthday they used to share, the performance cracks, he gets drunk, points a gun through Tony's window, and can't bring himself to fire. After that, he goes back to work, back to being useful, back to sitting in rooms with the man who actually did the killing as though it never happened. By the end, his own family is marrying into Tony's, which means Patsy didn't just survive his brother's murder. He spent years making himself valuable enough to the same system that killed him, until being close to it stopped looking like a wound and started looking like a life. Number 12, Tony B. He loses years while Tony Soprano lives the life that might have been. Tony B loses his entire adult life to a lie his cousin told to cover for a panic attack, and the person who tells that lie is the one who eventually decides Tony B should die. The hijacking that sends him to prison was supposed to include Tony Soprano too. Tony S. simply doesn't show up, invents an excuse, and lets his cousin serve almost 2 decades alone. Tony B comes home and genuinely tries to build something else. Training in massage therapy, of all things, for a man who spent his 20s running hijacking crews. He isn't equipped for how humiliating it is to start over at the bottom, and he wrecks the opportunity himself before criminal work pulls him back in and gets him killed within the year. Tony Soprano ends up sparing his cousin the torture Phil intends, a small kindness inside something ugly. The man whose lie put Tony B away is also the man who ends his life, and somehow still gets to be the one who lived it. Number 11, Rosalie. She grieves her son beside people who know why he really died. Rosalie shows just how much damage this world can do to someone who never breaks a single rule in it. She loses her husband to cancer and then loses her son to a murder everyone around her helped arrange, and she's never allowed to know it. She's told Jackie Jr. was killed by drug dealers, a story convenient enough that nobody bothers correcting it, even though Ralph, Vito, and Tony all know exactly what really happened. She spends years sitting at the same dinners and funerals as the people holding that truth back from her, grieving a version of events invented specifically so she'd never have to be told the real one. Even Meadow, who suspects the official story is wrong, can't bring herself to give Rosalie the truth. Rosalie doesn't need to be shot or arrested to have her whole life reshaped by this world. She just needs to love someone in it. Number 10, Johnny Sack. He reaches the top and loses the ability to protect the people he loves. Johnny Sack spends his whole life climbing toward a kind of power that's supposed to mean control over everything, and the one thing he actually loves the most is the one thing he can never protect. His love for Ginny is the most human thing about him, real enough that he'll start a war over a joke about her weight. None of that power helps once the government decides what his life looks like. He's allowed 6 hours out of custody to attend his own daughter's wedding, and even that gets cut short early, Marshall's hauling him out in handcuffs in front of the same people who once treated him as untouchable. He cries, and it embarrasses the other men more than it should. He dies in prison of lung cancer with his wife and daughters beside him, which means his family never actually leaves him. His tragedy is narrower and sadder than that. Loving them stops being enough the moment loving them is the only thing left he can do. Number 9. Vito. He reaches the life he was hiding and walks away from it. Vito is the rare person here who actually gets out. He runs to New Hampshire after his sexuality is exposed, finds a partner who doesn't need him to hide anything, and lives, for a while, an actual normal life with an actual ordinary job. He can't stand it. He misses the money and the status, and the particular version of himself that only existed inside the mafia, and being bored turns out to be a kind of suffering he has no tolerance for, after 20 years of never once being bored while extorting people for a living. So he goes back to the exact place that will get him killed for being himself, and Phil gets to him before Tony can decide what to do. His death is savage, and the damage doesn't end with him. His son becomes a target at school, his widow can't get the money to leave, and the family Tony half promises to help ends up an afterthought. One more thing he means to get around to and doesn't. Number 8. Carmela. She is told exactly what her life costs and stays anyway. Carmela's tragedy isn't that she doesn't know what she's part of. It's that she knows completely, and the knowledge changes nothing about what she chooses. For years, she keeps a moral line inside her own house. Tony does the crimes, she worries about the soul, and the arrangement lets her enjoy everything the money buys without calling herself complicit. Dr. Krakauer takes that comfort away in a single appointment, telling her flatly that leaving is the only path available she actually wants out. She doesn't take it. Furio gives the same conflict a shape she can feel, a man who's attentive in ways Tony stopped being, and he removes himself from her life rather than let it become something worse. She explodes at Tony and Whitecaps, using Furio specifically because she knows exactly which wound will land. Then she comes back anyway, builds a new house, stays married, and carries a clarity that never once talks her out of the life she's built on top of it. Number 7. Paulie. He outlives the two families that told him who he was. Paulie spends his whole life terrified of dying, and the crueler fact is that surviving costs him almost everyone who made his life feel like it meant something. He builds his whole sense of who he is around two families, the Mafia and Nucci, the woman he believes is his mother, and finds out late that even that second family was built on a lie. Nucci is his aunt, and his real mother led him believe otherwise his entire life. He responds with real cruelty, cutting Nucci off completely, and when he finally goes back to her, it's quiet, no speech, just sitting beside her watching television. She dies soon after, and even her funeral finds a way to humiliate him. The turnout is thin because everyone's at Christopher's wake instead, and Paulie somehow manages to make his own mother's funeral about losing to somebody else. The Mafia family thins out just as fast. Pussy, Christopher, Bobby, Silvio, one after another, until Paulie's sitting outside the pork store with almost nobody left who remembers the version of his life he actually cared about. He gets what he spent years begging every saint to give him. He just doesn't get anyone left to share it with. Number 6. Bobby. The life takes his gentleness and eventually takes him. Bobby is one of the gentlest men this show ever produces, and gentleness turns out to be something this world only tolerates until it becomes useful to remove. He's heavy, awkward, devoted to his family in a way that embarrasses the other men, and for years the running joke is that he's never killed anyone. That ends after he beats Tony in a fight, and Tony, humiliated, sends him to commit his first murder out of pure spite. Bobby does it, comes home, and holds his daughter the same night, crossing the exact line he'd spend years being mocked for staying on the right side of. The more trusted he becomes after that, the more New York sees him as someone worth eliminating, and he dies in a model train store surrounded by a hobby that never once made him $1 or scared anyone in his life. The qualities that once kept him apart from these men are exactly what the story strips away first, and only after they're gone does it take the rest of him too. Number 5. AJ. Passing down AJ is easy to write off as lazy and spoiled, and the uncomfortable truth is that the same qualities making him look pathetic are the ones keeping him from turning into his father. Violence disturbs him instead of empowering him. He reads about war and environmental collapse and carries the dread around without any idea what to do with it, which is at least an honest response. Unlike Tony's, who buries the same dread under appetite and control. When that dread finally overwhelms him, he ties a cinder block to his leg and jumps into the family pool, and the story nearly ends there. Tony pulls him out and holds him while he sobs, and for the first time, their relationship is simple. A father who nearly lost his son, and a son who wanted the pain to stop, and then, underwater, wanted to live more than he'd ever wanted anything. What he gets afterward is medication, a job in Little Carmine's film world, and a new car, the Soprano family's version of care, which is real and still isn't the same thing as giving him an actual reason to get up in the morning. Number 4, Junior. He lives long enough to forget what his whole life was. Junior spends his whole life protecting exactly one thing, his own name and reputation, and dementia takes it from him more completely than any rival ever could. He survives the mafia, prosecution, and cancer, obsessed the entire time with being remembered as someone who mattered. Then he starts losing track of who's alive and who's dead, shoots his own nephew because the past and present blur together in his head, and the grudges that once seemed worth killing over become pieces of information he can't reliably hold on to anymore. Tony visits near the end and reminds him that he and Johnny Boy once ran North Jersey, hoping the memory still carries weight. Junior takes it in like a mildly interesting fact about a stranger. He wanted to be unforgettable, and instead he becomes the one person in his own story who forgets it first. Number 3, Adriana. Adriana spends years betting on a version of Christopher the show never actually proves exists. He hits her, frightens her, humiliates her, and puts the mafia ahead of her over and over, and she keeps loving the parts of him that seem wounded and capable of becoming someone else. The FBI understands her vulnerability before she fully does, building trust through a planted friend until she's cooperating against the family that could kill her for it. When she finally tells Christopher the truth, it's the biggest bet of her life, that he loves her more than he loves the organization, and for one scene, the show lets that possibility feel real. Then Tony calls with a lie about a suicide attempt, and Silvio drives her toward the woods instead of a hospital. She dies believing, almost to the end, that she's being taken to the man she trusted, and she only learns the truth in the second she has no time left to do anything with it. Number 2, Christopher. Christopher gives up the one relationship that might have saved him to protect his standing with a man who eventually decides he's worth more dead than alive. Adriana offers him an actual future. Sobriety offers him a way to stop destroying himself. Neither one wins against his need for Tony's approval, and when Adriana confesses to informing, he chooses Tony and hands her a death sentence. The reward never comes. Staying sober makes him harder for the crew to tolerate. His one real shot at a life outside the mafia, a movie he writes and produces, still ends up being about his anger at Tony. Near the end, he kills a man who tried to see him as human, because even confession has turned back into violence for him by then. Tony kills him after a car crash, holding his nose shut while he's still breathing, and later admits to feeling relief instead of grief. Christopher spent his whole adult life convinced Tony was the man he'd go to hell for. He never gets to find out that the bargain was never actually reciprocal. Number 1, Tony. He spends his life wanting the mother he never had. Tony spends more time than almost anyone in this show trying to understand where his misery actually comes from, and understanding it changes almost nothing about what he does with it. 9 years of therapy get him a clearer picture of how deeply Livia shaped him, and he still can't stop passing the same damage forward. He wants, more than almost anything, a version of tenderness his mother never gave him. Even his hallucination of Isabella at his lowest point is nothing more than a woman being gently interested in him, which is how low the bar actually is. Livia is helping plan his murder at the exact same time. By the end, his closest male relationships are a graveyard he built with his own hands. Pussy, Tony B, and Christopher all dead because of him, and Junior's mind gone before Junior's body ever fails. Tony gets closer to the real answer than almost anyone around him ever does. He just never turns that answer into a different life, and by the time his son is in the pool and his uncle can't remember either of their names, Tony can see exactly how much of his family survived, unchanged, inside him.